This is Psych for Psychology's reading of Psychology by William James, Part 2. This book is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Hearing. The ear. The auditory organ in man consists of three portions, known respectively as the external ear, the middle ear or tympanum, and the internal ear or labyrinth. The latter contains the end organs of the auditory nerve. The external ear consists of the expansion seen on the exterior of the head, called the conchaeon, a passage leading in from it, the external auditory meatus G. This passage is closed at its inner end by the tympanic or drum membrane T. It is lined by skin, through which numerous small glands, secreting the wax of the ear, open. The tympanum P. Fig. 17 is an irregular cavity in the temporal bone, closed externally by the drum membrane. From its inner side the eustachian tube R proceeds and opens into the pharynx. The inner wall of the tympanum is bony except for two small apertures, the oval and round foramens, O and R, which lead into a labyrinth. During life the round aperture is closed by the lining mucous membrane, and the oval by the stirrup bones. The tympanic membrane T, stretched across the outer side of the tympanum, forms a shallow funnel with its concavity outwards. It is pressed by the external air on its exterior, and by air entering the tympanic cavity through the eustachian tube on its inner side. If the tympanum were closed, these pressures would not be always equal when barometric pressure varied, and the membrane would be bulged in or out according as the external or internal pressure on it were the greater. On the other hand, were the eustachian tube always open, the sounds of our own voices would be loud and disconcerting. So it is usually closed, but every time we swallow it is open, and thus the air pressure in the cavity is kept equal to that in the external auditory meatus. I'm making a balloon ascent or going rapidly down. A deep mine, the sudden and great change of aerial pressure outside frequently causes painful tension of the drum membrane, which may be greatly alleviated by frequent swallowing. The auditory ossicles. Three small bones lie in the tympanum, forming chain from the drum membrane to the oval foramen. The external bone is the malleus or hammer, the middle one, the incus or anvil, and the internal one, the stave or stirrup. Accommodation is provided for in the ear as well as in the eye. One muscle an inch long, the tensor tympani, arises in the petrous portion of the temporal bone, running in canal parallel to the eustachian tube, and is inserted into the malleus below its head. When it contracts, it makes the membrane of the tympanum more tense. Another smaller muscle, the stapedius, goes to the head of the stirrup bone. These muscles are by many persons felt distinctly contracting when certain notes are heard, and some can make them contract at will. In spite of this, uncertainty still reigns as to their exact use in hearing, though it is highly probable that they give to the membranes which they influence the degree of tension best suited to take up whatever rates of vibration may fall upon them at the time. In listening, the head and ears in lower animals, and the head alone in man, are turned so as best to receive the sound. This also is a part of the reaction called readaptation of the organ. See the chapter on attention. The internal ear. The labyrinth consists primarily of chambers and tubes hollowed out in the temporal bone and enclosed by it on all sides, except for the oval and round foramens on its exterior and certain apertures for blood vessels and auditory nerve. During life all these are closed watertight in one way or another. Lying in the bony labyrinth thus constituted are membranous parts of the same general form but smaller, so that between the two a space is left of this is filled with a watery fluid called the paralympha, and the membranous internal ear is filled by a similar liquid, the endolymph. The bony labyrinth. The bony labyrinth is described in three portions: the vestibule, semicircular canals, and the cochlea. The casts of its interior are represented from different aspects in Fig. 19. The vestibule is the central part, and has on its exterior the oval foramen into which the base of the stirrup bone fits. Behind the vestibule are three bony semicircular canals, communicating with the back of the vestibule at each end, and dilated near one end to form an ampulla. The bony cochlea is a tube coiled on itself, somewhat like a snail's shell, and lying in front of the vestibule. The membranous labyrinth. The membranous vestibule, lying in the bony, consists of two sacs communicating by a narrow aperture. The posterior is called the utriculus, and into it the membranous semicircular canals open. The anterior, called the sacculus, communicates by a tube with the membranous cochlea. The membranous semicircular canals much resemble the bony, and each has an ampulla. In the ampulla, one side of the membranous tube is closely adherent to its bony protector. At this point nerves enter the former. The relations of the membranous to the bony cochlea are more complicated. A section through this part of the auditory apparatus shows that its osseous portion consists of tube 1 2 and a half times round essential bony axis, the modiolus, from the axis. A shelf, the lamina spiralis, projects and partially subdivides the tube, extending farthest across in its lower quills. Attached to the outer edge of this bony plate is the membranous cochlea, scala media, a tube triangular in cross-section and attached by its base to the outer side of the bony cochlear spiral. The spiral lamina and the membranous cochlea thus subdivide the cavity of the bony tube into an upper portion, the scala vestibula SV, and a lower, the scala tympani, and between these lie the lamina spiralis, LSO, and the membranous cochlea, the latter being bounded above by the membrane of Reissner and below by the basilar membrane. The membranous cochlea does not extend to the tip of the bony cochlea. Above its apex, the scala vestibuli and scala tympani communicate. Both are filled with perilymph, so that when the stapes is pushed into the oval foramen by the impact of an airwave on the tympanic membrane, a wave of perilymph runs up the scala vestibuli to the top, where it turns into the scala tympani, down whose whorls it runs and pushes out the round foramen are ruffling, probably the membrane of Reissner and the basilar membrane on its way up and down. The terminal organs. The membranous cochlea contains certain solid structures seated on the basilar membrane and forming the organ of Corti. This contains the end organs of the cochlear nerves. Lining the sulcus spiralis, a groove in the edge of the bony lamina spiralis, are cubital cells. On the inner margin of the basilar membrane they become columnar, and then are succeeded by a row which bear on their upper ends a set of short stiff hairs, and constitute the inner hair cells, which are fixed below by a narrow apex to the basilar membrane and nerve fibers enter them. To the inner hair cells succeed the rods of Corti. These rods are stiff and arranged side by side in two rows, leaned against one another by their upper ends so as to cover in the tunnel. They are known respectively as the inner and outer rods, the former being nearer the lamina spiralis. The inner rods are more numerous than the outer, the numbers being about 6,000 and 4,500 respectively. Attached to the external sides of the heads of the outer rods is the reticular membrane, which is stiff and perforated by holes. External to the outer rods come 4 rows of outer hair cells, connected like the inner row with nerve fibers, and their bristles project into the holes of the reticular membrane. Beyond the outer hair cells is ordinary columnar epithelium, which passes gradually into cubital cells lining most of the membranous cochlea. From the upper lip of the sulcus spiralis projects the tectorial membrane, which extends over the rods of Corti and the hair cells. Sensory epithelium from ampulla or semicircular canal and saccule. At N, a nerve fiber pierces the wall, and after branching enters the 2 hair cells C. At H, a columnar cell with a long hair is shown, the nerve fiber being broken away from its base. The slender cells at F seem unconnected with nerves. The hair cells would thus seem to be the terminal organs for picking up the vibrations which the airwaves communicate through all the intervening apparatus, solid and liquid, to the basilar membrane. Analogous hair cells receive the terminal nerve filaments in the walls of the saccule, utricle, and ampullae. The various qualities of sound. Physically, sounds consist of vibrations, and are, generally speaking, aerial waves. When the waves are non-periodic, the result is noise. When periodic, it is what is nowadays called tone, or no. The loudness of sound depends on the force of the waves. When they recur periodically, peculiar quality called pitch is the effect of their frequency. In addition to loudness and pitch, tones have each their voice or timbre, which may differ widely in different instruments, giving equally loud tones of the same pitch. This voice depends on the form of the aerial wave. Pitch, a single puff of air set in motion by no matter what cause, will give a sensation of sound, but it takes at least 4 or 5 puffs or more to convey a sensation of pitch. The pitch of the note C, for instance, is due to 132 vibrations. A second, that of its octave C, is produced by twice as many, or 264 vibrations, but in neither case is it necessary for the vibrations to go on during a full second for the pitch to be discerned. Sound vibrations may be too rapid or too slow in succession to produce sonorous sensations, just as the ultraviolet and ultrared rays of the solar spectrum fail to excite the retina. The highest pitched audible note answers to about 38,016 vibrations in a second, but it differs in individuals. Many persons cannot hear the cry of bat nor the chirp of cricket, which lie near this upper audible limit. On the other hand, sounds of vibrational rate about 40 per second are not well heard, and little below this they produce rather than a true tone sensation, and are only used along with notes of higher octaves, to which they give character of greater depth. The entire system of pitches forms a continuum of one dimension, and that is to say, you can pass from one pitch to another only by one set of intermediaries, instead of by more than one, as in the case of colors. A whole series of pitches is embraced in and between the terms of what is called the musical scale. The adoption of certain arbitrary points in the scale as notes has an explanation partly historic and partly aesthetic, but too complex for exposition here. The timbre of a note is due to its waveform. Waves are either simple, pendular, or compound. Thus, if a tuning fork, which gives waves nearly simple, vibrate 132 times a second, we shall hear the note C. If simultaneously a fork of 264 vibrations be struck, giving the next higher octave, C, the arrow movement at any time will be the algebraic sum of the movements due to both forks, whenever both drive. Ere one way they reinforce one another, when on the contrary the recoil of one fork coincides with the forward stroke of another, they detract from each other's effect. The result is movement which is still periodic, repeating itself at equal intervals of time, but no longer pendular, since it is not alike on the ascending and descending limbs of the curves. We thus get that the fact that non-pendular vibrations may be produced by the fusion of pendular, or a technical phrase, by their composition. Suppose several musical instruments, as those of an orchestra, to be sounded together. Each produces its own effect on the air particles, whose movements, being an algebraical sum, must at any given instant be very complex, yet the ear can pick outable and follow the tones of any one instrument. Now in most musical instruments it is susceptible of physical proof that with every single note that is sounded many upper octaves and other harmonic sounds simultaneously in fainter form, on the relative strength of this or that one or more. These Helmholtz has shown that the instrument's peculiar voice depends. The several vowel sounds in the human voice also depend on the predominance of diverse upper harmonics accompanying the note on which the vowel is sung. When the two tuning forks of the last paragraph are sounded together, the new form of vibration has the same period as the lower-pitched fork, yet the ear can clearly distinguish the resultant sound from that of the lower fork alone, as a note of the same pitch but a different timbre, and within the compound sound the two components combine. A trained ear be severally heard. Now how can one resultant waveform make us hear so many sounds at once? The analysis of compound waveforms is supposed, after Helmholtz, to be effected through the different rates of sympathetic resonance of the different parts of the membranous cochlea. The basilar membrane is some 12 times broader at the apex of the cochlea than at the base where it begins, and is largely composed of radiating fibers which may be likened to stretched strings. Now the physical principle of sympathetic resonance says that when stretched strings are near a source of vibration, those whose own rate agrees with that of the source also vibrate, the others remaining at rest. On this principle, waves of parallel running down the scala tympaniae. A certain rate of frequency ought to set certain particular fibers of the basilar membrane vibrating, and ought to leave others unaffected. If then each vibrating fiber stimulated the hair cell above it, and no others, and each such hair cell sending a current to the auditory brain center, awakened therein, a specific process to which the sensation of one particular pitch was correlated, physiological condition of our several pitch sensations would be explained. Suppose now a chord to be struck in which perhaps 20 different physical rates of vibration are found. At least 20 different hair cells or end organs will receive the jar, and if the power of mental discrimination be at its maximum, 20 different objects of hearing, in the shape of as many distinct pitches of sound, may appear before the mind. The rods of Corti are supposed to be dampers of the fibers of the basilar membrane, just as the malleus, incus, and stapes are dampers of the tympanic membrane, as well as transmitters of its oscillations to the inner ear. There must be, in fact, an instantaneous damping of the physiological vibrations, for there are no such positive after-images, and no such blendings of rapidly successive tones, as the retina shows us in the case of Lie. Helmholtz's theory of analysis of sounds is plausible and ingenious. One objection to it is that the keyboard of the cochlea does not seem extensive enough for the number of distinct resonances required. We can discriminate many more degrees of pitch than the 20,000 hair cells, more or less, will allow for. The so-called fusion of sensations in hearing. A very common way of explaining the fact that waves which singly give no feeling of pitch give one when recurrent is to say that there are several sensations fused into a compound sensation. A preferable explanation is that which follows the analogy of muscular contraction. If electric shocks are sent into a frog's sciatic nerve at slow intervals, the muscle which the nerve supplies will give a series of distinct twitches, one for each shock. But if they follow each other at the rate of as many as 30 a second, no distinct twitches are observed, but a steady state of contraction instead. Steady contraction is known as tetanus. The experiment proves that there is a physiological accumulation or overlapping of processes in the muscular tissue. It takes the 20th of a second or more for the latter to relax after the twitch due to the first shock, but the second shock comes in before the relaxation can occur, then the third again, and so on, so that continuous tetanus takes the place of discrete twitching. Similarly in the auditory nerve, one shock of air starts in a current to the auditory brain center and affects the latter so that a dry stroke of sound is heard. If other shocks follow slowly, the brain center recovers its equilibrium after each, to be again upset in the same way by the next, and the result is that for each shock of air, a distinct sensation of sound occurs. But if the shock comes in too quick succession, the later ones reach the brain before the effects of the earlier ones on the organ have died away. There is thus an overlapping of processes in the auditory center, a physiological condition analogous to the muscle's tetanus, to which new condition, a new quality of feeling, that of pitch, directly corresponds. This latter feeling is a new kind of sensation altogether, not a mere appearance due to many sensations of dry stroke being compounded into one. No sensations of dry stroke can exist under these circumstances, for their physiological conditions have been replaced by others. What compounding there is has already taken place in the brain cells before the threshold of sensation was reached. Just so red light and green light beating on the retina in rapid enough alternation arouse the central process to which the sensation yellow directly corresponds. The sensations of red and of green get no chance, under such conditions, to be born. Just so, if the muscle could feel, it would have a certain sort of feeling when it gave a single twitch, but it would undoubtedly have a distinct sort of feeling altogether when it contracted titanically, and this feeling of the titanic contraction would by no means be identical with a multitude of the feelings of twitching. Harmony and discord. When several tones sound together, we may get peculiar feelings of pleasure or displeasure designated as consonance and dissonance respectively. A note sounds most consonant with its octave, when with the octave the eighth third and the fifth of the note are sounded. For instance, C, E, G. See, we get the full chord or maximum of consonants. The ratios of vibration here are as 4, 5, 6, 8, so that one might think simple ratios were the ground of harmony, but the interval C, D is discordant with the comparatively simple ratio 8, 9. Helmholtz explains discord by the overtones making A beats together. This gives subtle grating which is unpleasant, where the overtones make no beats or beats too rapid. For their effect to be perceptible, there is consonance, according to Helmholtz, which is thus negative rather than a positive thing. One explains consonance by the presence of strong identical overtones in the notes which harmonize. No one of these explanations of musical harmony can be called quite satisfactory, and the subject is too intricate to be treated farther in this place. Discriminative sensibility of the ear. Weber's law holds fairly well for it. Intensity of sounds. If ivory or metal balls are dropped on an ebony or iron plate, they make sound which is the louder as they are heavier or drop from greater height. Experimenting in this way, after others, Merkel found that the just perceptible increment of loudness required an increase of 3/10 of the original stimulus everywhere between the intensities marked 20 and 5,000 of his arbitrary scale. Below this, the fractional increment of stimulus must be larger. Above it, no measurements were made. Discrimination of differences of pitch varies in different parts of the scale. In the neighborhood of 1,000 vibrations per second, 1/5 of a vibration more or less can make the sound sharp or flat for a good ear. It takes a much greater relative alteration to sound sharp or flat elsewhere on the scale. The chromatic scale itself has been used as an illustration of Weber's law. The notes seem to differ equally from each other, yet their vibration number form a series of which each is a certain multiple of the last. This, however, has nothing to do with intensities or just perceptible differences, so the peculiar parallelism between the sensation series and the outer stimulus series forms here a case all by itself rather than an instance under Weber's more general law. Chapter 5. Touch, the temperature sense, the muscular sense, and pain. Nerve endings in the skin. Many of the afferent skin nerves end in connection with hair bulbs. The fine hairs over most of the cutaneous surface, projecting from the skin, transmit any movement impressed on them with increased force to the nerve fibers at their fixed ends. Fine branches of axis cylinders have also been described as penetrating between epidermic cells and ending there without terminal organs. In or immediately beneath the skin, several peculiar forms of nerve end organs have also been described. They are known as 1. Touch cells, 2. Basinian corpuscles, 3. Tactile corpuscles, 4. End bulbs. These bodies all consist essentially of granules formed of connective tissue in which are round about which one or more sensory nerve fibers terminate. They probably magnify impressions just as a grain of sand does in a shoe or a crumb, does in a finger of a glove. Touch, or the pressure sense. Through the skin we get several kinds of sensation. Touch proper, heat and cold, and pain. and we can with more or less accuracy localize them on the surface of the body. The interior of the mouth possesses also 3 sensibilities. Through touch proper, we recognize pressure or traction exerted on the skin and the force of the pressure, the softness or hardness, roughness or smoothness of the body producing it, and form of this when not too large to be felt all over. When to learn the form of an object, we move the hand over it. Muscular sensations are combined with proper tactile and such. A combination of the 2 sensations is frequent. Moreover, we rarely touch anything without at the same time getting temperature sensations. Therefore, pure tactile feelings are rare. From an evolution point of view, touch is probably the first distinctly differentiated sensation. In this primary position, it still largely holds in our mental life. Objects are most important to us when in direct contact. The chief function of our eyes and ears is to enable us to prepare ourselves for contact with approaching bodies, or to ward such contact off. They have accordingly been characterized as organs of anticipatory touch. The delicacy of the tactile sense varies on different parts of the skin. It is greatest on the forehead, temples, and back of the forearm, where a weight of 2 milliger, pressing on an area of 9 sq millim, can be felt. In order that the sense of touch may be excited, neighboring skin areas must be differently pressed. When the hand is immersed in a liquid, as mercury, which fits into all its inequalities and presses with practically the same weight on all neighboring immersed areas, the sense of pressure is only felt at a line along the surface where the immersed and non-immersed parts of the skin meet. The localizing power of the skin. When the eyes are open, a point of the skin is touched, we can with some accuracy indicate the region stimulated. Although tactile feelings are in general characters alike, they differ in something besides intensity by which we can distinguish them. Some subsensation quality not rising definitely into prominence in consciousness must be present, comparable to the upper partials determining the timbre of a tone. The accuracy of the localizing power varies widely in different skin regions and is measured by observing the least distance which must separate 2 objects as the blunted points of a pair of compasses in order that they may be felt as 2. The following table illustrates some of the differences observed. Tongue tip 1.1 millimeters, 0.4 inch palm side of last phalanx of finger 2.2 millimeters, 0.8 inch red part of lips 4.4 millimeters, 0.16 inch tip of nose 6.6 millimeters, 0.24 inch back of second phalanx of finger 11 millimeters, 0.44 inch heel 22 millimeters, 0.88 inch back of hand 30.8 millimeters, 1.23 inches forearm 39.6 millimeters, 1.58 inches sternum 44 millimeters, 1.76 inches back of neck 52.8 millimeters, 2.11 inches middle of back 66 millimeters, 2.64 inches. The localizing power is a little more acute across the long axis of eliminate and better when the pressure is only strong enough to just cause a distinct tactile sensation than when it is more powerful. It is also very readily and rapidly improvable by practice. It seems to be naturally delicate in proportion as the skin which possesses it covers a more movable part of the body. It might be thought that this localizing power depended directly on nerve distribution, that each touch nerve had connection with a special brain center at one end, excitation of which caused a sensation with a characteristic local sign, and at the other end was distributed over a certain skin area, and that the larger this area, the farther apart might 2 points be and still give rise to only one sensation. If this were so, however, the peripheral tactile areas each being determined by the anatomical distribution of a nerve fiber must have definite unchangeable limits, which experiment shows that they do not possess. Suppose the small areas in Fig. 25 to each represent a peripheral area of nerve distribution. If any 2 points in C were touched, we should, according to the theory, get but a single sensation, but if, while the compass points remained the same distance apart, or were even approximated, one were placed in C and the other on a contiguous area, 2 fibers would be stimulated, and we ought to get 2 sensations. But such is not the case on the same skin region. The points must be always the same distance apart, no matter how they be shifted, in order to give rise to 2 just distinguishable sensations. It is probable that the nerve areas are much smaller than the tactile, and that several stimulated must intervene between the excited in order to produce sensations which shall be distinct. If we suppose 12 unexcited nerve areas must intervene, then, in Fig. 25, and B will be just on the limits of a single tactile area, and no matter how the points are moved, so long as 11 or fewer unexcited areas come between, we would get a single tactile sensation. In this way, we can explain the fact that tactile areas have no fixed boundaries in the skin, although the nerve distribution in any part must be constant. We also see why the back of a knife laid on the surface causes a continuous linear sensation, although it touches many distinct nerve areas. If we could discriminate the excitations of each of these from that of its immediate neighbors, we should get the sensation of a series of points touching us, one for each nerve region excited, but in the absence of intervening unexcited nerve areas, the sensations are fused together. The temperature sense, its terminal organs. By this we mean our faculty of perceiving cold and warmth, and, with the help of these sensations, of perceiving temperature differences in external objects. Its organ is the whole skin, the mucous membrane of mouth and fauces, pharynx and gullet, and the entry of the nares, direct heating or cooling of. A sensory nerve may stimulate it and cause pain, but not a true temperature sensation, hence we assume the presence of temperature end organs. These have not yet been ascertained anatomically. Physiologically, however, the demonstration of special spots in the skin for feeling heat and cold is one of the most interesting discoveries of recent years. If one draw a pencil point over the palm or cheek, one will notice certain spots of sudden coolness. These are the cold spots. The heat spots are less easy to single out. Goldscheder, Blix, and Donaldson have made minute exploration of the terminate tracts of skin and found the heat and cold spots thickset and permanently distinct. Between them, no temperature sensation is excited by contact with a pointed cold or hot object. Mechanical and faradic irritation also excites, and these points are specific feelings respectively. The feeling of temperature is relative to the state of the skin. In a comfortable room, we feel at no part of the body either heat or cold, although different parts of its surface are at different temperatures, the fingers and nose being cooler than the trunk, which is covered by clothes, and this, in turn, cooler than the interior of the mouth. The temperature which a given region of the temperature organ has, as measured by a thermometer when it feels neither heat nor cold, is its temperature sensation 0 and is not associated with any one objective temperature. For not only, as we have just seen, does it vary in different parts of the organ, but also on the same part from time to time. Whenever a skin region has a temperature above its sensation 0, we feel warmth, and vice versa. Sensation is more marked the greater the difference, and the more suddenly it is produced. Touching a metallic body, which conducts heat rapidly to or from the skin, causes a more marked hot or cold sensation than touching a worse conductor, as a piece of wood of the same temperature. The change of temperature in the organ may be brought about by changes in the circulatory apparatus. More blood flowing through the skin warms it, and thus leads to its cooling, or by temperature changes in gases, liquids, or solids in contact with it. Sometimes we fail to distinguish clearly whether the cause is external or internal. A person coming in from a windy walk often feels a room uncomfortably warm, which is not really so. The exercise has accelerated his circulation and tended to warm his skin, but the moving outer air has rapidly conducted off the extra heat. On entering the house, the stationary air there does this less quickly. The skin gets hot, and the cause is supposed to be oppressive heat of the room. Hence, frequently, opening windows and sitting in a draught with its concomitant risks of whereas keeping quiet for 5 or 10 minutes until the circulation has returned to its normal rate would attain the same end without danger. The acuteness of the temperature sense is greatest at temperatures within a few degrees of third Idig C. 86 Dig F, at these differences of less than 0.1 Dig C, can be discriminated. As means of measuring absolute temperatures, however, the skin is very unreliable on account of the changeability of its sensation 0. We can localize temperature sensations much as tactile, but not so accurately. Muscular sensation. The sensation in the muscle itself cannot well be distinguished from that in the tendon or in its insertion. In muscular fatigue, insertions are the places most painfully felt. In muscular rheumatism, however, the whole muscle grows painful, and violent contraction such as that caused by the faradic current, or known as cramp, produces severe and peculiar pain felt in the whole mass of muscle affected. Sachs also thought that he had demonstrated, both experimentally and anatomically, the existence of special sensory nerve fibers, distinct from the motor fibers, in the frog's muscle, the latter, and in the terminal plates, the former in network. Great importance has been attached to the muscular sensus factor in our perceptions, not only of weight and pressure, but of the space relations between things generally. Our eyes and our hands, in their explorations of space, move over it and through it. It is usually supposed that without the sense of an intervening motion performed, we should not perceive two seen points or two touched points to be separated by an extended interval. I am far from denying the immense participation of experiences of motion in the construction of our space perceptions, but it is still an open question how our muscles help us in these experiences, whether by their own sensations, or by awakening sensations of motion on our skin, retina, and articular surfaces. The latter seems to me the more probable view, and the reader may be of the same opinion after reading Chapter 6. Sensibility to weight. When we wish to estimate accurately the weight of an object, we always, when possible, lift it, and so combine muscular and articular with tactile sensations. By this means we can form much better judgments. Weber found that whereas 1/3 must be added to a weight resting on the hand for the increase to be felt, the same hand actively hefting the weight could feel an addition of as little as 1/17. Merkel's recent and very careful experiments, in which the finger pressed down the beam of a balance counterweighted by from 25 to 8,020 grams, showed that between 200 and 2,000 grams, a constant fractional increase of about 1/13 was felt when there was no movement of the finger, and of about 1/19 when there was movement. Above and below these limits the discriminative power grew less. Pain. The physiology of pain is still an enigma. One might suppose separate afferent fibers with their own end organs to carry painful impressions to a specific pain center, or one might suppose such a specific center to be reached by currents of overflow from the other sensory centers when the violence of their inner excitement should have reached a certain pitch. Or again, one might suppose a certain extreme degree of inner excitement to produce the feeling of pain in all the centers. It is certain that sensations of every order, which in moderate degrees are rather pleasant than otherwise, become painful when their intensity grows strong. The rate at which the agreeableness and disagreeableness vary with the intensity of a sensation is roughly represented by the dotted curve in Fig. 27. The horizontal line represents the threshold both of sensational and of agreeable sensibility. Below the line is the disagreeable. The continuous curve is that of Weber's law, which we learned to know in Fig. 2p. 18. With the minimal sensation, the agreeableness is nil, as the dotted curve shows. It rises at first more slowly than the sensational intensity, then faster, and reaches its maximum before the sensation is near its acme. After its maximum of agreeableness, the dotted line rapidly sinks and soon tumbles below the horizontal into the realm of the disagreeable or painful, in which it declines. That all sensations are painful when too strong is a piece of familiar knowledge. Light, sound, odors, the taste of sweet, even cold, heat, and all the skin sensations must be moderate to be enjoyed. The quality of the sensation complicates the question, however, for in some sensations, bitter or sour salt, and certain smells, the turning point of the dotted curve must be drawn very near indeed to the beginning of the scale. In the skin, the painful quality soon becomes so intense as entirely to overpower the specific quality of the sort of stimulus. Heat, cold, and pressure are indistinguishable. When extreme, we only feel the pain. The hypothesis of separate end organs in the skin receives some corroboration from recent experiments for both. Blix and Goldscheder have found, along with their special heat and cold spots, also special pain spots on the skin. Mixed in with these are spots which are quite feelingless. However, it may stand with the terminal pain spots, separate paths of conduction to the brain for painful and for merely tactile stimulations of the skin are made probable by certain facts. In the condition termed analgesia, a touch is felt, but the most violent pinch, burn, or electric spark destructive of the tissue will awaken no sensation. This may occur in disease of the cord, by suggestion and hypnotism, or in certain stages of ether and chloroform. Intoxication. In rabbits, a similar state of things was produced by Skiff by dividing the gray matter of the cord, leaving the posterior white columns intact. If, on the contrary, the latter were divided and the gray substance left, there was increased sensitiveness to pain, and possibly touch proper was lost. Such experiments make it pretty certain that when afferent impulses reach the spinal cord at any level and there enter its gray matter with the posterior root fiber, they travel on in different tracks to conscious centers, the tactile ones coming soon out of the gray network and coursing on in a readily conducting white fiber, while the painful ones travel on farther in the gray substance. It is still uncertain if both impulses reach the cord in the same fibers. The gray network conducts nerve impulses, but not easily. They tend soon to be blocked in it. A feeble tactile impulse reaching it by an afferent fiber might only spread a short way and then pass out into a single good conducting fiber in a white column and proceed to the brain, while a stronger, painful impulse would radiate farther in the gray matter and perhaps break out of it by many fibers leading to the brain through the white columns, and so give rise to an incoordinate and a localized sensation. That pains are badly localized, and worse the more intense they are, is a well-known fact. which would thus receive an explanation. Pain also gives rise to ill-coordinated movements of defense. The stronger the pain, the more violent the start. Doubtless in low animals, pain is almost the only stimulus, and we have preserved the peculiarity insofar that today it is the stimulus of our most energetic, though not of our most discriminating, reactions. Taste, smell, as well as hunger, thirst, nausea, and other so-called common sensations need not be touched on in this book, as almost nothing of psychological interest is known concerning them. Chapter 6. Sensations of Motion. I treat of these in a separate chapter in order to give them the emphasis which their importance deserves. They are of two orders. 1. Sensations of objects moving over our sensory surfaces, and 2. Sensations of our whole person's translation through space. 1. The sensation of motion over surfaces. This has generally been assumed by physiologists to be impossible until the positions of terminus quo and terminus ad quem are severally cognized, and successive occupancies of these positions by the moving body are perceived to be separated by distinct interval of time. As a matter of fact, however, we cognize only the very slowest motions in this way. Seeing the hand of clock at 12 and afterwards at 6, I judge that it has moved through the interval. Seeing the sun now in the east and again in the west, I infer it to have passed over my head. But we can only infer that which we already generically know in some more direct fashion, and it is experimentally certain that we have the feeling of motion given us as direct and simple sensation. Schermak long ago pointed out the difference between seeing the motion of the second hand of a watch when we look directly at it, and noticing the fact that it has altered its position, whilst our gaze is fixed upon some other point of the dial play. In the first case we have a specific quality of sensation which is absent in the second. If the reader will find a portion of his skin, the arm, for example, where a pair of compass points an inch apart are felt as one impression, and if he will then trace lines a tenth of an inch long on that spot with a pencil point, he will be distinctly aware of the point's motion and vaguely aware of the direction of the motion. The perception of the motion here is certainly not derived from a pre-existing knowledge that its starting and ending points are separate positions in space, because positions in space 10 times wider apart fail to be discriminated as such when excited by the compass points. It is the same with the retina. One's fingers when cast upon its peripheral portions cannot be counted, that is to say, the 5 retinal tracts which they occupy are not distinctly apprehended by the mind as 5 separate positions in space, and yet the lightest movement of the fingers is most vividly perceived as movement and nothing else. It is thus certain that our sense of movement, being so much more delicate than our sense of position, cannot possibly be derived from it. Virot, at almost the same time, called attention to certain persistent illusions, amongst which are these. If another person gently trace line across our wrist or finger, the latter being stationary, it will feel to us as if the member were moving in the opposite direction to the tracing point. If, on the contrary, we move our limb across fixed point, it will seem as if the point were moving as well. If the reader will touch his forehead with his forefinger kept motionless, and then rotate the head so that the skin of the forehead passes beneath the finger's tip, he will have an irresistible sensation of the latter being itself in motion in the opposite direction to the head. So, in abducting the fingers from each other, some may move and the rest be still, but the still ones will feel as if they were actively separating from the rest. These illusions, according to Virot, are survivals of our primitive form of perception, when motion was felt as such, but ascribed to the whole content of consciousness, and not yet distinguished as belonging exclusively to one of its parts. When our perception is fully developed, we go beyond the mere relative motion of thing and ground, and can ascribe absolute motion to one of these components of our total object, and absolute rest to another. When, in vision for example, the whole field of view seems to move together, we think it is ourselves or our eyes which are moving, and any object in the foreground which may seem to move relatively to the background is judged by us to be really still. But primitively this discrimination is not perfectly made. Sensation of the motion spreads over all that we see and infects it. Any relative motion of object and retina both makes the object seem to move, and makes us feel ourselves in motion. Even now when our whole field of view really does move, we get giddy and feel as if we too were moving, and we still see an apparent motion of the entire field of view whenever we suddenly jerk our head and eyes or shake them quickly to and fro. Pushing our eyeballs gives the same illusion. We know in all these cases what really happens, but the conditions are unusual, so our primitive sensation persists in check. So it does when clouds float by the moon. No, the moon is still, but we see it move faster than the clouds. Even when we slowly move our eyes, the primitive sensation persists under the victorious conception. If we notice closely the experience, we find that any object towards which we look appears moving to meet our eye. But the most valuable contribution to the subject is the paper of G. H. Schneider, who takes up the matter zoologically and shows by examples from every branch of the animal kingdom that movement is the quality by which animals most easily attract each other's attention. The instinct of shamming death is no shamming of death at all, but rather paralysis through fear, which saves the insect, crustacean, or other creature from being noticed at all by his enemy. It is paralleled in the human race by the breath-holding stillness of the boy playing. I spy to whom the seeker is near, and its other side is shown in our involuntary waving of arms, jumping up and down, and so forth when we wish to attract someone's attention at distance. Creatures stalking their prey and creatures hiding from their pursuers alike show how immobility diminishes conspicuity. In the woods, if we are quiet, the squirrels and birds will actually touch us. Flies will light on stuffed birds and stationary frogs. On the other hand, tremendous shock of feeling the thing we are sitting on begin to move, the exaggerated start it gives us to have an insect unexpectedly pass over our skin, or cat noiselessly come and snuffle about our hand, the excessive reflex effects of tickling, etc., show how exciting the sensation of motion is per se. Kitten cannot help pursuing moving ball. Impressions too faint to be cognized at all are immediately felt if they move. Fly sitting is unnoticed. Feel it the moment it crawls. Shadow may be too faint to be perceived. If we hold finger between our closed eyelid and the sunshine, we do not notice its presence. The moment we move it to and fro, however, we discern it. Such visual perception as this reproduces the conditions of sight among the radiates. In ourselves, the main function of the peripheral parts of the retina is that of sentinels, which, when beams of light move over them, cry "Who goes there?" and call the fovea to the spot. Most parts of the skin do but perform the same office for the fingertips. Of course, movement of surface under object is, for purposes of stimulation, equivalent to movement of object over surface. In exploring the shapes and sizes of things by either eye or skin, the movements of these organs are incessant and unrestrainable. Every such movement draws the points and lines of the object across the surface, imprints them 100 times more sharply, and drives them home to the attention. The immense part thus played by movements in our perceptive activity is held by many psychologists to prove that the muscles are themselves the space-perceiving organ, not surface sensibility, but the muscular sense is for these writers the original and only revealer of objective extension. But they have all failed to notice with what peculiar intensity muscular movements call surface sensibilities into play, and how largely the mere discernment of impressions depends on the mobility of the surfaces upon which they fall. Our articular surfaces are tactile organs which become intensely painful when inflamed. Besides pressure, the only stimulus they receive is their motion upon each other. To the sensation of this motion more than anything else seems due the perception of the position which our limbs may have assumed. Patients cutaneously and muscularly anesthetic in one leg can often prove that their articular sensibility remains, by showing, by movements of their well leg, the position in which the surgeon may place their insensible one. Goldscheder and Berlin cause fingers, arms, and legs to be passively rotated upon their various joints in a mechanical apparatus which registered both the velocity of movement impressed and the amount of angular rotation. The minimal felt amounts of rotation were much less than a single angular degree in all the joints except those of the fingers. Such displacements as these, Goldscheder says, can hardly be detected by the eye. Anesthesia of the skin produced by induction currents had no disturbing effect on the perception, nor did the various degrees of pressure of the moving force upon the skin affect it. It became, in fact, all the more distinct in proportion as the concomitant pressure feelings were eliminated by artificial anesthesia. When the joints themselves, however, were made artificially anesthetic, the perception of the movement grew obtuse, and the angular rotations had to be much increased before they were perceptible. All these facts prove, according to Herr Goldscheder, that the joint surfaces, and these alone are the seat of the impressions by which the movements of our members are immediately perceived. 2. Sensations of movement through space. These may be divided into feelings of rotation and feelings of translation. As was stated at the end of the chapter on the ear, the labyrinth semicircular canals, utricle and saccule, seems to have nothing to do with hearing. It is conclusive, established today, that the semicircular canals are the organs of our sixth special sense, that namely of rotation. When subjectively excited, this sensation is known as dizziness or vertigo, and rapidly engenders the farther feeling of nausea. Irritative disease of the inner ear causes intense vertigo, Meniere's disease. Traumatic irritation of the canals in birds and mammals makes the animals tumble and throw themselves about in a way best explained by supposing them to suffer from false sensations of falling, etc., which they compensate by reflex muscular acts that throw them the other way. Galvanic irritation of the membranous canals in pigeons caused just the same compensatory movements of head and eye which actual rotations impressed on the creatures produce. Deaf and dumb persons, amongst whom many must have had their auditory nerves or labyrinths destroyed by the same disease which took away their hearing, are in a very large percentage of cases found quite insusceptible of being made dizzy by rotation. Perkinch and Mach have shown that, whatever the organ of the sense of rotation may be, it must have its seat in the head. The body is excluded by Mach's elaborate experiments, the semicircular canals, being, as it were, 6 little, spheroid levels in 3 rectangular planes, seem admirably adapted to be organs of a sense of rotation. We need only suppose that when the head turns in the plane of any one of them, the relative inertia of the endolymph momentarily increases its pressure on the nerve termini in the appropriate ampulla, which pressure starts a current towards the central organ for feeling vertigo. This organ seems to be the cerebellum, and the teleology of the whole business would appear to be the maintenance of the upright position. If a man stand with shut eyes and attend to his body, he will find that he is hardly for a moment in equilibrium. Incipient fallings towards every side in succession are incessantly repaired by muscular contractions which restore the balance, and although impressions on the tendons, ligaments, foot soles, joints, etc., doubtless are among the causes of the compensatory contractions, yet the strongest and most special reflex arc would seem to be that which has the sensation of incipient vertigo for its afferent member. This is experimentally proved to be much more easily excited than the other sensations referred to. When the cerebellum is disorganized, the reflex response fails to occur properly, and loss of equilibrium is the result. Irritation of the cerebellum produces vertigo, loss of balance, and nausea, and galvanic currents through the head produce various forms of vertigo correlated with their direction. It seems probable that direct excitement of the cerebellar center is responsible for these feelings. In addition to these corporeal reflexes, the sense of rotation causes compensatory rollings of the eyeballs in the opposite direction, to which some of the subjective phenomena of optical vertigo are due. Steady rotation gives no sensation. It is only starting or stopping, or more generally speaking, acceleration, positive or negative, which impresses the end organs in the ampullae. The sensation always has little duration, however, and the feeling of reverse movement after whirling violently may last for nearly a minute, slowly fading out. The cause of the sense of translation, movement forwards or backwards, is more open to dispute. Seat of this sensation has been assigned to the semicircular canals when compounding their currents to the brain, and also to the utricle. The latest experimenter, M. Delitzsch, considers that it cannot possibly be in the head, and assigns it rather to the entire body, so far as its parts, blood vessels, viscera, etc., are movable against each other and suffer friction or pressure from their relative inertia when movement of translation begins. Delitzsch's exclusion of the labyrinth from this form of sensibility cannot, however, yet be considered definitively established, so the matter may rest with this mention. This has been part 2 of Psyched for Psychology's reading of Psychology, the book by William James, 1890. Thanks for listening.